So with that, I'd like to welcome our speakers and say the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Alenka, and hi everybody who's here today. Hello, good morning from Germany. We thank you very much for your invitation to speak here today, and also for your kind introduction. In the following, we would like to share with you some insights and findings from our current qualitative research project. And in our talk, we will focus on how schools in Germany respond to the uncertain futures of Ukrainian refugee children and how these practices relate to inclusion and exclusion. To begin with, uncertainty regarding one's future is not limited to the experience of forced migration alone. It can be seen as a constitutive element of human existence in late modernity. Yet in the context of forced migration, experiences of uncertainty become increasingly relevant. Having to leave one's familiar social surrounding due to war, political repression, natural disasters, or other reasons means that future plans may be disrupted, have to be reworked, or given up altogether. Moreover, insecurity over residency or return options increase the difficulty of anticipating the future and planning ahead in a long-term sense. As studies from different European countries have shown, national education systems and individual schools are often ill-equipped to deal with these uncertainties that arise from students' experiences of forced migration. This is, very general speaking, partly due to the fact that they operate, so schools operate according to the logic of mass education, which is not designed to respond to learners' individual needs in the first place. While the logic of mass education reflects the democratic claim of education for all, it also implies that schools are still today largely organized according to an institutional logic that is based on the ideal of a homogeneous group of learners who must progress at the same pace. This ideal is closely linked with the institutional practice of structuring school careers according to age-related norms, allowing for linearization and standardization of educational pathways. This implies that all individuals are expected to achieve particular goals at a certain age, more or less regardless of their biographical past, present, and anticipated future. This can be seen as a characteristic part of what we refer to in our talk as the institutional timescape of modern education systems. We will come back to this term a little later. So by obscuring the always existing multiple temporalities and timing mechanisms of lived experience, as Carrie Facer puts it, the dominant institutional timescape and its related practices tend to reproduce social and educational inequalities. It is likely to create exclusion, particularly with regard to learners who experienced migration or forced migration, whose educational pathways are discontinuous and who therefore easily fail to meet these temporal expectations. As schools tend to struggle to respond to learning biographies that are disrupted by moving in between nation states and different education systems, Vijita Rajan sees the discord between mobile childhoods and immobile schools as the fundamental problematic of educational inclusion of migrant children. Schools, as organizations, claim to act neutrally and objectively. However, they do rely on normative expectations of learners' biographical pasts that remain mostly implicit. These underlying expectations imply the idea of a settled and undisturbed family childhood that is located in one national and lingual context only. And this points to a second general feature of modern education systems, which is likely to put children who experience migration at a disadvantage. School as an institution has been historically shaped and in many ways still operates as of today according to the logic of the nation state. The underlying norm of monolingual and mononational and white childhoods become obvious, for example, when examining school curricula and learning materials, and also with regard to the expectations of the linear temporal order of school careers I just mentioned. In light of these expectations, biographies of learners that are not congruent with these, because, for example, children grow up in multilingual contexts or their educational pathways are disrupted by migration, are likely to be regarded as deficient. These introductory remarks point to rather general features of modern education systems and their tendency to reproduce exclusion, especially with regard to forced migration. In our talk, we will focus on the actual practices of single schools in Germany responding to the reality of forced migration following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. We will do so based on our current qualitative research project, which is called New Inclusions and Exclusions in the context of current forced migrations. So assuming that temporal expectations are particularly relevant in the shaping of the educational trajectories of children and youth who experienced forced migration, we pay particular attention to the question how uncertain futures of refugee students are constructed and discussed by education professionals against the backdrop of the dominant institutional timescape. Furthermore, we will examine what pedagogical and organizational practices are related with these expectations and how they might reproduce differentiated forms of institutional exclusion. As mentioned before, we draw on the concept of timescapes. Ellen, can you skip the coined by Barbara Adam, to analyze how temporal logics become relevant in institutional practices and shared knowledge of education professionals. Carrie Facer defines timescapes as rhythms of life that naturalize the values and structures of institutions, communities, particular places, and whole societies. So the concept draws attention to how temporal logics shape social reality and how situated and provisional notions of time and temporality are naturalized. Facer argues that by appearing natural and neutral, institutional timescapes can be seen as an effective form of invisible power, and that they are productive in the sense that they structure values and beliefs in often invisible ways. So from this perspective, the education system is involved in creating an institutional timescape that shapes individuals' educational trajectories and their future and students' future options. Through its linear temporal logic, it can produce isolation and objectification of those whose bodies or worldviews can or will not align with the dominant rhythm. Contemporary practices of time management in public schools can also be situated within broader neoliberal social discourses and educational policies. However, due to limited time, we will not go into further detail on this.
Yeah, we would like to begin with giving you a brief overview of the discourse on forced migration in the education system that informs our study before presenting some of our empirical findings. Since the post-war period, forced migration and migration in general to Germany has been constructed as mainly a temporary phenomenon, so a phenomenon that has repeatedly hit German society in waves that were again and again disrupting and upsetting social routines and normality. In consequence, migration in the German education system was mainly addressed through the temporary introduction of support mechanisms, while asylum seekers and children without a secure residency status were exempted from compulsory schooling in most of the 16 German federal states until the late 1990s. And this has changed then with the inclusion of refugee children in compulsory education in all federal states. However, the arrival of forced migrants, especially from Syria, who increasingly fled to Germany since 2015, has shown that forced migration is still hardly recognized as a permanent reality, let alone a new normal, by state institutions and legislation. Newly arrived children and youth have since encountered ambivalent integration policies in and through education. So, on the one hand, these policies aimed at the rapid acquisition of the German language and quick integration into school, vocational training, higher education, and the labor market, which were seen as essential for successful integration and participation in our society, as stated by the Standing Conference of the Ministers of Education in Germany in 2016. But on the other hand, in most federal states, newcomers were mainly taught in separate classes, so-called welcome classes, preparatory, reception, or international support classes. And these classes had been set up for a period of typically up to 2 years. So while the administrative measures were aimed at speeding up the process of arrival, particularly with regard to integration into the labor market, several studies have shown that a number of restrictions and barriers repeatedly jeopardize the long-term future prospects of newly arrived refugees in Germany. With view to the state of research on the situation of refugee students in the German school system, in recent years, particular attention has been paid to forms of social exclusion that occur in the context of these so-called welcome arrival preparatory classes. These separate classes have primarily been identified as places of selection, characterized by a lack of qualified teachers and specialized content, putting children and young people at a massive disadvantage regarding their chances of a successful educational career. And studies of other school systems in the European Union have produced similar findings, for example, by highlighting the risks of children's reduced participation in the wider school community when being taught in segregated classes. These studies argue, for example, that practices of segregated education represent a compensatory model, and this model mainly aims to re-socializing newly arrived students to enable them to participate in school, thus allowing mainstream schools to be excused from questioning themselves, as no major changes to the system were required. However, previous studies have also shown that more inclusive arrangements in which students participate in mainstream classes from the outset can also lead to subtle forms of exclusion, as these students are often not recognized as legitimate members of these mainstream classes. They experience various forms of exclusionary inclusion, such as being left behind or being othered from the so-called regular students in everyday learning and teaching practices of those regular classes. Against this backdrop, the latest political and administrative developments related to the arrival of refugees from Ukraine indicate a potential shift in perspective towards the acceptance of forced migration as the new normal. So this shift can be observed in accordance with the flexibilization of migration and welfare state regulations for Ukrainian citizens in the European Union. For example, in March 2022, conditions have been created to allow for an unbureaucratic recruitment of teachers from Ukraine. And these measures also include the possibility for students from Ukraine to participate in digital distance learning based on the Ukrainian curriculum. And those new measures also allow to obtain an Ukrainian diploma in addition to attending regular school lessons in Germany. But this provision is limited to students from Ukraine only, and it also leaves it up to the individual student or its family to decide if and how to participate in the two national education systems. However, it seems that these measures could somehow encourage schools to acknowledge the uncertainty of refugee students' futures by allowing educational participation in two contexts simultaneously. At the same time, the current rise of right-wing populist anti-migration discourse, both in Germany and the European Union member states, is once again leading to increased uncertainty among refugees. These developments are also limiting refugee students' opportunities to develop long-term future prospects in Europe. Currently, we can observe that calls for an acceleration of migration management aiming to speed up integration into the labor market go hand in hand with demands for more and more rapid deportations of forced migrants from so-called safe regions of origin. And there are also some regions in Ukraine that are currently being discussed as such safe regions of origin. So we can say that the current integration policies for forced migrants in Germany and the European Union, they remain very ambiguous and very contested.
Yeah, we will now explain a bit more on our research design and methodological approach, our own research. So we, in our project, we want to examine how single schools relate to the newly arrived students from Ukraine. And we started our data collection early in November 2022 and finished it in February 2023. And we conducted 40 semi-structured interviews with principals, teachers, and school social workers in 19 secondary schools of different school types. There are different school types in Germany in 2 federal states. All schools had enrolled children and young people from Ukraine during the school year of 2022-23. And while some schools, especially grammar schools, had no prior experience in receiving and teaching refugee children, the majority of schools did. So in the interviews with school professionals, we were particularly interested in generating narratives about how refugee students were included in school and in the classroom in general, and specifically in the context of the refugee migration from Ukraine. We also wanted to stimulate reflection on processes of transformation that the interviewees might have witnessed in their schools since the forced migration movement from Syria in 2015-16. To gain insights into the policy framework and legal requirements, we also analyzed selected policy documents on migration and integration, including regulations issued by the ministries of education and the school authorities in both federal states. In analyzing the interview data, we examined institutional practices as they were described by the interviewees and the ways in which the interviewees related to these practices, partly reproducing and legitimizing them, partly modifying or critically reflecting on exclusionary practices. We analyzed the interviews starting with a process of thematic coding, followed by a line-by-line analysis of sequences within the analytic categories that seemed particularly relevant to our research question. In this process, we compared sequences both within and across interviews, following the idea of finding minimal and maximum contrasts. During this process, the coding of the material was refined and differentiated. And in the analysis, the question of uncertain future prospects of refugee students from Ukraine emerged as a key issue. And we will now present some results of our analysis to show how schools were dealing with the uncertain future of refugee students at the time. having in mind that things change quite quickly, like it was mentioned in the beginning. So the future prospects of children of youth from Ukraine are a central topic raised by our interviewees, and this topic is discussed particularly with regard to students' different motivations for either staying in Germany or returning to Ukraine. In many interviews, the teachers state that students from Ukraine were generally very negative about the prospect of a longer stay in Germany, fueled by their desire to return home. So, for example, a principal from a grammar school says, it is particularly noticeable with the Ukrainian children that they always have the goal in mind. I think, I want to go home again, and I don't really want to be here. And what am I supposed to do here? So here, as in other interviews, the children's perceived future prospects of returning to Ukraine are attributed only to their own will and desire. Any external limitations on an imagined future in Germany, such as temporary residence permits, are not mentioned. Some teachers associate this will, their students' will to return, with a lack of students' will to integrate or to learn German, as mentioned in the following quote from a social worker. He says, well, we have noticed that many Ukrainian children don't really have this absolute will to integrate or to learn German. I mean, I think there's this wish behind it. Well, we'll be going back soon anyway. This is really a big difference to Syrian refugees. So in constructing the desire to return as a specific attitude of children from Ukraine, a distinction is made between Ukrainian children and refugees from other regions, such as Syria, where the Ukrainian children are not considered absolutely willing to integrate. The Syrian refugees are. The school's expectation that the pupils should integrate is linked with the expectation of demonstrating their will to learn the German language. Although many teachers state that they can understand their students' desire to return, it is discussed as a rather irrational and unrealistic wish that cannot be realized in the near future. At the same time, it is seen as an obstacle to creating a future perspective for staying in Germany. In this context, the need to learn German, despite the strong motivation to return to Ukraine, is presented as a dilemma, as the principal of a community school explains. So she says, Ellen, can you? Thank you. She says, some students just don't want to learn German. They say they're going back, definitely. They don't want to learn no German. So we all hope for the best for the Ukrainian people, that they can return to their home country very quickly if they want to, but we can't predict how long it will take. And that's actually this dilemma for us, to persuade them that it's important to also learn German, because we can't say how long children will have to be in Germany, yes, even if they don't want to. So here the principal reflects on her main task of dealing with the aforementioned dilemma by breaking the children's resistance and convincing them of the importance of learning German despite the uncertainty about the length of their stay. She also mentions how teachers relate to students when this persuasion fails. Well, we'll try to convince the children that it's important for them to learn German, but that's all we can do. Yes, and so the German as a second language teacher now says that he first devotes his energy to the children who want to learn, so that they get a chance, and the others are integrated and included. But if they close themselves off and don't want to, he can't help them. That's just the way it is. So the willingness to learn German appears as a prerequisite for being able to teach them. Focusing only on those who want to learn means that students who fail to demonstrate a willingness to learn are most likely left behind. This means that students' behavior is largely held responsible for the teacher's decision as to whether they spend energy on them. This practice is presented as a fair and reasonable way of dealing with differentiated motivations with regard to learning the German language. Exclusion therefore appears as an unavoidable result of the student's lack of motivation, while the underlying normative expectation of a linear, unobstructed learning trajectory remains unquestioned. So the fact that students are faced with a situation of uncertainty regarding their future is not seen as something that might require further reflection. The solution of teaching those who are willing to learn can be seen as a way of adjusting to the institutional timescape, which expects teachers and students to proceed in a predefined pace. There are further examples that underline that teachers and schools' responses to refugee students' uncertain futures are intertwined with schools' institutional timescape. Our analyses indicate that this timescape requires that students' uncertain futures are translated into certain futures. As opposed to this, experiences of the provisional, the transitory, the uncertain, which were essential for many Ukrainian students at the time, are ruled out. Student biographies characterized by notions of ambiguity and the not yet are therefore likely to be marginalized.
Yeah, in addition to practices aimed at transforming uncertain futures of refugee students into certain futures, we have observed various dynamics that attempt to speed up or to accelerate the pace of refugee students in German schools. First of all, the schooling of refugee children in the public education system is organized and structured by a range of temporal regulations. For example, education policies set timeframes that define the maximum duration of German as a second language classes, and there are fixed term employment contracts issued by the authorities for teachers, for the teachers of these classes. And there are also specific time limits for suspending the grading of newly arrived students. And there is a maximum age for admission to secondary school in both federal states, which means that young people exceeding this age are expected to participate in vocational education. We see that these time limits impose a certain pace of refugee education on both on the students and on the schools. And against this backdrop, many of the teachers who we have interviewed stated that the children from Ukraine were learning German at a much slower pace than it is needed to catch up and to be able to follow the curriculum in the regular classes. In some interviews, this is accompanied by a feeling of impatience and sometimes a lack of understanding as to why the children from Ukraine do not learn German more quickly. It has been said, for example, they've been at my school for a year now, and I've never had students who could speak so little German after 1 year. Another principal says, but I think more and more that they should actually start saying things a bit more in German. It's been long enough now. These and other sequences from the interviews highlight the tensions that arise when students do not yet seem to have internalized the institutional timescapes. Then it's quite likely that they will be perceived as unwilling or as unable to adapt to this time regime. In expressing their impatience with the Ukrainian children, some teachers refer to other refugee students who arrived at the schools a few years earlier, especially from the Middle Eastern countries such as Syria. And these students here form kind of a reference group with which the Ukrainian students are compared to. And this comparison seems to be used in order to emphasize the impression that the students from Ukraine learn German particularly slowly. And this is expressed, for example, in the following statements. So it's so complicated when I look at my Arab students who come from Syria or other European countries who learn relatively quickly and who are also open, and it makes a big difference who I teach. And later in this interview with the teacher, she further argues, and then our teachers also have a bit of a problem at the moment. We keep getting feedback that these students are actually the most exhausting and the situation is actually the most difficult we've ever had as far as German as a second language students are concerned. The perceived slowness of refugee students from Ukraine to adapt to the expectations of the German school system is attributed here to supposed group-specific characteristics. And these characteristics are presented as a burden, mainly for the teachers and for the school. And the students' alleged failure to adapt is rated as something that they cannot really afford to do, and which forces the schools to intervene, as the following teacher explains. The students actually have to give up their reticence when they are 14 or 15, because it's about entering the labor market. It's about skills that they'll need no matter where they end up living. But next year, they would practically get normal school certificates. If they have lived here for 2 years, according to education law, they then move to regular classes and actually get grades. So it's time to check on them and to have one-on-one conversations and say, so what's the situation? What can we do now? Can the next step come now? So that this reticence ends and one finally starts doing and working. The perceived self-inflicted isolation of Ukrainian students here is seen as an obstacle to the acquisition of skills that are considered relevant, regardless of where they end up living. And the need to give up this reticence is associated with a certain age, 14 or 15, so an age which is linked to the transition to working life. What we can observe here is that the time pressure articulated by the teacher due to time constraints and administrative requirements for grading is passed here on to the students, and they are individually encouraged to take concrete and specific steps towards their future. And at the same time, the need to make progress according to institutional expectations is presented here by the teacher as a prerequisite for being able to act and work with the students. These interview responses shed some light on institutional practices of acceleration in the context of co-enforced migrations. These practices of acceleration set the pace for refugee students' integration into the school. According to these timescapes, refugee students are differentiated, segmented, and assessed according to two groupings: pupils from Ukraine on the one side and pupils from other countries, especially from Syria, on the other side. And by doing so, Ukrainian students are to some extent under a general suspicion of being too slow to adapt to the dominant institutional timescapes. So they run the risk of teachers losing patience with them, which could lead to a withdrawal of pedagogical support and thus to institutional exclusions. Yeah, until now in this presentation, we mainly try to show how certain institutional timescapes guide the management of uncertain futures of refugee children in German schools. However, some interviewees also openly criticize the exclusionary consequences of some administrative temporal regulations. And this concerns, for example, the regulation that determines when newly arrived refugees must be regularly assessed in schools. Actually, the administrative regulations in the two federal states in our study allow schools to exempt refugee students from assessment for the first 1 or 2 years after their arrival. However, teachers from one federal state reported that the situation had suddenly changed due to a new regulation that schools received in the middle of the school year, just some months after many of the students from Ukraine had just arrived. And this regulation stated that from now on, Ukrainian students had to be assessed in all subjects. And this measure can be seen as a means of speeding up the integration process by involving the children in formal procedures and thus making them accountable for their performance. One teacher describes the consequence of this new regulation as quite frustrating. He says, "But now, unfortunately, the decision was made that the students should be assessed, and of course, they now have to be challenged to a certain extent, which actually leads to great frustration for me and many other colleagues, and certainly also leads to great frustration among the students. The students are assessed like normal native speakers, even though they don't have anywhere near the same chance of mastering the whole thing. So before, they were doing quite well and were able to arrive at their own pace and try try to work through the whole thing, yes. And then they just said, yes, the students receive regular German as a second language courses, and many have already made great progress linguistically. From now on, they will be assessed. Yes, which is of course great for the students if they only get Ds and Es from one day to the next. Very frustrating for the students, for us, because I think it's impossible to catch up in such a short amount of time. Yeah, this teacher, he criticizes the practice of all of a sudden treating students as native speakers, depriving them of the time needed to actually have a chance to catch up. He anticipates that this will lead to deep frustration among the students, as they will inevitably receive poor grades due to their limited command of German at this stage. With this in mind, he concludes that language learning processes cannot simply be accelerated or compressed. In addition to these critical perspectives on the institutional timescape in the context of forced migration, we also found some examples of how schools attempt to resist the institutional time pressure to some extent. One aspect of the prevailing timescape that was problematized in many interviews concerns the admission of students who are 15 years or older when they enter the German school system. These students have a limited amount of time to acquire a level of German that will enable them to pass their final exams. For example, the principal of a community school reported her school offers students aged 15 and over the opportunity to repeat classes more than once in order to achieve a higher qualification. To this end, she also reported more generous performance assessments. She says, "We've cheated a lot. Sometimes we say, yes, then it's still a D, then it's not the E, whatever. But they are going to get the degree, right? It doesn't hurt us, and they go their way, right? They'll get there eventually." We interpret this approach of granting extended learning time and adapting grading practices to the situation as a way of undermining the institutional timescapes that otherwise determines the educational trajectories of refugee children and youth. However, by labeling her school's actions cheating, the principal portrays its approaches as clandestine, and the practice of allowing students to repeat classes several times may not be entirely beneficial to them, since age-related norms are also applied in later stages of formal education. So, in other words, allowing students to exceed the maximum age may therefore limit their educational opportunities at a later stage.
The findings of our study show that institutional timescapes dominate how teachers relate to the educational trajectories of children from Ukraine. As Bob Lingard and Greg Thompson argue, notions of progress and the correct order are crucial to how school is constructed and lived. This institutional logic invokes a morality in which time is a currency. It is not passed, but spent. On the other hand, our results support previous empirical findings that highlighted the significance of time regimes with regard to refugee students in public schools. On the other hand, however, the refugee migration from Ukraine reveals some new dynamics of inclusion and exclusion linked with the temporal regime of schools. Our findings show that the logic of acceleration that has been described for segregated schooling models, which are understood as temporary measures, also prevails in long-term, partially inclusive learning arrangements in regular classes. Here, the logic of acceleration is interwoven with the unilinear notion of rapid integration. With it goes a neglection of the individual pace of arrival processes and the need for refugee children and youth to navigate a fragile present. This reflects dominant neoliberal timescapes of the public schools that are characterized by a logic of linear progress and competition. As shown in our analyses, schools pass this pressure on to students, while viewing exclusion as an unavoidable result of students' unwillingness to adapt to institutional expectations. At the same time, the time pressure exerted on pupils or students and their families is not likewise directed at schools. This would, for example, mean to develop more inclusive concepts of teaching and learning that might reduce the need to partially exclude newcomer students. Instead, practices of exclusion are structurally maintained. The prevailing view of forced migration as a temporary phenomenon has led schools to reactivate old systems of partially segregated schooling. At the same time, the dominant understanding of full participation as a one-sided integration process on part of the newcomers may encourage practices of making pedagogical support during this process dependent on the patience of teachers and on students' explicit expression of their will to integrate. This willingness is primarily measured by the speed of learning German, while teachers have the final say on whether students are learning fast enough or too slow.
Yeah, our study also shows that temporal expectations embedded in schools' organization are also productive insofar as they reproduce distinctions between different groups of newcomers. By drawing on typifications based on nationality or ethnicity, a distinction is made between children and youth from Ukraine versus children from other regions. At the same time, a hierarchy is established based on which groups are perceived as willing and able to adapt to the institutional timescape. These essentializing distinctions are used to justify and legitimize institutional exclusions, such as leaving some students behind, for example, in the German as a second language classes. However, our findings also show that many educational professionals are aware of these institutional timescapes and how they dominate everyday school life. And while some educational professionals criticize, resist, or temporarily try to suspend the dominant timescapes, these practices of resistance are quite fragile because they are easily discredited or come under pressure from unexpected policy changes and/or demands from local authorities. Yeah, in light of all these findings, we think it is necessary to encourage and empower educational professionals to challenge dominant institutional timescapes and their inherent logics of exclusion for students who have experienced forced migration. However, this presupposes that the focus on societal and political discourse shifts from the short-term and assimilationist logic of temporary support measures for newcomers to a more sustainable vision of an education system based on its democratic promises. Yeah, this brings us to the end of this presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen to us, and we are very grateful to you, Olenka, for giving us this opportunity to present our research. I see there's not so much time left, but we would like to briefly discuss our findings with you, and we would also very much be interested in hearing your thoughts and also your observations on dominant timescapes in Canada. So we are interested if the dynamics in your country are similar or rather different. We are very curious about that, but first of all, thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really fascinating research, and and the theory of timescapes was a very interesting approach to uncovering or revealing some of the challenges. So thank you very much. Let's open this up to anyone who would like to make a comment or ask a question. Please raise your hand if you can, or feel free just to indicate in the chat that you would like to say something. Daria?
Yes, I have a question. I'm not sure if, yes. Thank you, Alok. I am representing here actually the German context as well, so I cannot give you, unfortunately, feedback or Canadian one, but we get very similar result in our research, although we had a parent's perspective, and this is actually very frustrating and sad that they are not considered so far enough into this educational politics as well, and the perspectives of children are also blended out. So we have a lot of research from the teacher's perspective. And what we are doing now, actually, now we are doing the research about the students, Ukrainian students attending the Ukrainian schools online. And we got very interesting results because like this is actually everything is resulting, their participation is resulting out of this kind of frustration in German educational system. But anyway, I will not describe you the result. But my question is about the evaluation of this German as a second language courses. There are still no concepts at all through the whole Germany. There are like these names, Willkommensklassen or Vorbereitungsklassen, but indeed there is no concept behind it. There are different namings for these classes, but there is no concept, and these classes were never evaluated. So, and before to do something, we need to know what to do, because we have a lot of resources also invested in these classes. But what we know from our current research, this is a completely not really like supporting and depicting the realities of the kids and their parents. So my question is about the evaluation. Do you think it would bring something? If so, then maybe I don't know how to start this process, how to encourage the politics, the politicians, I know the educators to work in that direction. To start, how to get to know what should we do with the newcomers, what are their plans and expectations from this educational system?
Thank you for your comment and your question. It would be so interesting to exchange with you on your research. When I got it right, you also conducted a research study in German, in the German context. Okay, then we should discuss later on about this, also about the perspectives that the teachers from Ukraine and the students from Ukraine brought in, as these, as you said, are absolutely missing, kind of almost missing in our study due to some reasons. And as to your question of the evaluation of the German as a second language classes, there are not so many. I mean, I remember one study that was focusing on researching on the performances and on how easy it is for the students to become part of the schools. That shows that it was much more difficult for the students from the German as a second language classes to adapt to the performance and to become part of the regular school system and classes than when they've been sent to the inclusive or to the regular classes from the beginning on. And on the other hand, I think there are not so many studies on these classes, as they were thought to be or meant to be rather temporary measures. With the idea to install a better inclusive system after a certain amount of time, which was not the case, as we just could observe in the case of the Ukrainian students of Ukraine. These classes still exist, but actually they were not meant to exist for such a long period of time, and this might explain why there are not so many or any evaluations when it comes to these classes. But what do you think, Dorothee?
Yeah, I agree. And at the same time, I think there were some, it's not evaluation studies, but rather like smaller qualitative studies, scholars who did ethnographies, for example, of what was going on in different kinds of learning arrangements. And I think these are very valuable because we can learn from them how the mechanisms work of and also they give insight into experiences of pupils who attended these classes. And this might not be the same as evaluation studies, but still, I think they are valuable to look at if we want to understand the problems and maybe also ideas of improving things. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question. Given that you were collecting your data soon after the war began, I am wondering if you have considered students' experiences of trauma as influencing any of the results of your studies.
Yeah, I think, well, our perspective was on the teachers' views, and the teachers did mention trauma as a category. And many of the people we interviewed also criticized that there were no support measures whatsoever for the students from Ukraine who experienced traumatic situations, which is, of course, a problem. At the same time, the teachers do not have enough knowledge about, well, what does it mean, trauma? And is everybody traumatized who experienced something yeah, like people experience when they are in war? And so that's an interesting category, really, the category of trauma, how it's used by education professionals, and on what knowledge base they recur when they use this category. So that would be interesting, certainly, to have a closer look at our interviews under this perspective.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that we are finding in some of our research is that students exhibit behaviors that teachers do not, that teachers interpret as perhaps misbehavior, and not as possible signs of trauma. And of course, without having trauma-informed practices as a part of their teaching experience or repertoires, this is an area that remains unexplored with possible consequences. Thank you.
Can we ask, can you tell us something about the situation in Canada, Lenka, regarding this problem? Are there different approaches in Canada, or
Well,
we have the
that's
same problem?
that's a good question. Canada is made up of 10 provinces and 3 territories, and each has its own education system. And in that way, information across provinces is not really shared, I would say. Or maybe a better word is not collaboratively explored. Different provinces might explore the question in their own way. And then the second interesting thing is the difference between what we would call perhaps a school report or a provincial report on the situation versus research that would be funded to explore a situation. And so we often will await reports being completed and made accessible so that those can be explored and integrated into perhaps research proposals. But I think one thing we've noticed is Canada has a very large Ukrainian community and diaspora. And so when families arrive in urban areas that already have a fairly well created a well-developed diaspora, I think responses would be different. And in Alberta, we have a Ukrainian bilingual program that began almost 50 years or over 50 years ago now. And it also exists in 2 neighboring provinces. And so when the children first arrived after the war, these programs were literally bursting at the seams. Schools added extra modular classrooms, and even with those schools accepting all of the students, some students were turned away and integrated into other English classrooms. And the general approach to helping refugee students is a kind of ESL temporary program with as quick integration as possible. And of course, the older the students, the greater the challenge, you would say. We are eager to get students to receive the number of credits they earn or they need in order to graduate, and help them move on, very similar to what I think you're describing. That would be my observation. Would anyone like to add anything else? I think that's a good question. And maybe what you're really suggesting is maybe we need to do a webinar focusing on the research we know to date about the Canadian situation. We'll be sure to keep you informed, and hopefully you'll join us then.
Yeah, we would love to join that. Yeah.
So I'm looking at the clock and mindful that this was scheduled as a 1-hour webinar. Thank you very much, Ellen and Dorothee. You've certainly introduced us to concepts that we can take into our own situation. And we do hope that you'll stay in touch with us. We also would like to invite the viewers to complete the survey about this webinar. The link is in the chat. And has this research been published, Ellen or Dorothee?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
We are working on a paper in English language. So we published some findings in German in some German journals in Germany, but we are working on an English translation.
Well, please keep us posted because we also have a newsletter, and we'd be happy to share that and provide the abstract for other people who might be interested. So, vielen Dank.
Thanks so Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank. Thank you for having us.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of our viewers today. Do pobачення.
Yeah. Thank you.